Right now, in showrooms in London, Milan, and a quiet manufacturing town in North Rhine-Westphalia, 3 names move a serious amount of velvet. Holland Sherry, a house better known for suiting wool, quietly maintains one of the more sophisticated velvet ranges in the luxury interiors trade, including pile weaves built from mohair rather than the cotton or silk most people assume velvet has to be made from. Anstoetz, a German family firm most designers have never heard of unless they work in high-end upholstery, produces velvet by the tens of thousands of meters a year, some of it flame-retardant enough for hotel lobbies, some of it soft enough for a duchess's headboard. And Zoffany, a British textile house whose entire brand identity rests on a centuries-deep fabric archive, still markets its cotton velvets today by leaning specifically and deliberately on the word heritage. Here's what's strange about that word choice. None of these companies are selling velvet because it's rare anymore. It isn't. You can buy a velvet throw pillow at a discount home goods store for less than the price of lunch. What Holland Sherry, Anstoetz, and Zoffany are actually selling, when they reach for words like heritage and archive and atelier, is a memory. A folk memory of a time when velvet wasn't available to anyone with a credit card, when owning it could get you arrested. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That's a documented legal fact, and it's where this story really begins. Picture a courtroom in a northern Italian city-state sometime in the early 16th century. The defendant isn't a thief. He isn't accused of violence, forgery, or smuggling. He is, by most accounts, a moderately successful tradesman, the kind of man who could genuinely afford fine cloth. His offence, laid out plainly in the municipal record, is that he wore a garment trimmed in velvet that his social rank did not entitle him to wear. The penalty wasn't symbolic. Fines in cases like this were often set at levels equivalent to months of an ordinary worker's income. And beyond the money, there was the public dimension, humiliation in front of neighbours, delivered as a deliberate civic message. The message being, cloth is not neutral. Cloth has a rank, and if you outdress your rank, the state will notice. Try translating that logic into today's world for a second, and it collapses into absurdity. Nobody is fined for owning a nice couch. Nobody's velvet blazer gets confiscated by a magistrate. And that gap between how casually we treat this fabric now and how seriously entire governments once treated it is the real subject of this video. The popular version of velvet's story goes something like this. Velvet is old. Velvet is royal. Velvet has always been the fabric of kings. Full stop. End of story. It's a clean narrative. It's also mostly wrong, or at least badly incomplete. The real story is stranger and considerably more interesting, because it isn't really about royalty at all. It's about guilds willing to inflict real violence to protect a manufacturing secret. It's about merchant families who used velvet money to buy their way past the very laws designed to keep them out of the aristocracy. It's about the Catholic Church's uneasy relationship with luxury, and in maybe the strangest twist in the whole story, it's about a royal court that built an entire fasciities, iron movement around convincing all of Europe that restraint was actually the most expensive thing you could wear. We're going to take all of that apart piece by piece, but first we need to understand what velvet physically is, because the politics only make sense once you understand exactly how hard this fabric was to make. Here's a fact that surprises a lot of people. Velvet isn't defined by what it's made of. It's defined by how it's built. Cotton velvet, silk velvet, mohair velvet, today's polyester velvet. Chemically, these fibers have almost nothing in common. And yet all of them get called velvet, because velvet is a structural category, not a fiber category. It refers to a specific and genuinely brutal weaving technique that produces an upright, brushed pile surface instead of the flat woven face you'd get from something like satin, twill, or plain linen. Here's how that structure actually gets built. A weaver working velvet has to run 2 entirely separate warp systems through the loom simultaneously, one forming the base cloth and a second set of threads that get looped deliberately over thin metal rods laid crosswise into the weave at precise, repeating intervals. Once a section is woven, those rods get withdrawn. And at that point, the weaver faces a choice. Leave the loops standing, and you get what's called loop pile or uncut velvet, texturally interesting, but not the fabric most people picture. Or take a specialized blade and slice through every single loop individually, and you get the dense, soft, upright cut pile that gives finished velvet its signature texture. That famous shift in color depending on which way you run your hand across it. That color shifting effect deserves its own explanation, because it's genuinely one of the more elegant bits of physics hiding inside a piece of cloth. Each individual pile fiber in cut velvet stands roughly vertical rather than lying flat. So light hitting the fabric doesn't behave uniformly. It depends entirely on angle. Light that catches the flat cut tip of each fiber bounces back toward your eye more directly, reading as brighter and more reflective. Light that instead strikes the fiber along its length gets absorbed more and reads darker, almost matter. Brush your palm one direction, you flatten the pile forward and see the lighter reading. Brush it back, you tip the pile the other way, and the same exact fabric, same exact dye lot, suddenly looks noticeably darker. No trick of dye, no trick of weave pattern, just geometry and light. This is not a minor curiosity. It created a genuine professional hazard for anyone working with the finished cloth. Tailors and upholsterers had to track nap direction obsessively. Cut 2 panels of the same bolt without paying attention to which way the pile leaned, and you'd get 2 pieces that visibly don't match in a finished garment or a piece of furniture, even though they came from the identical roll of fabric. That's an entire extra layer of technical skill required just to use velvet correctly once it left the loom, before you even get to the difficulty of weaving it in the first place. And the difficulty of weaving it was, by contemporary accounts, enormous. Running 2 simultaneous warp systems, inserting metal rods at exact, consistent intervals across the entire width of a bolt. Then, for cut velvet, performing a slicing pass precise enough that one slip of the blade could destroy days of already completed labor. A weaver working plain cloth or twill could turn out several times more finished yardage in the same stretch of time as a weaver working velvet, and that output gap translated directly into price. Surviving merchant ledgers from several Italian trading houses record velvet purchases costing multiples of what a comparably sized piece of fine silk satin or damask fetched in the very same season, from the very same market. So before we even get to guilds, secrecy, or sumptuary law, velvet was already expensive for the most boring possible reason. It was punishingly slow and unforgiving to produce. Everything else in this story is beautés, built on top of that basic economic fact. Here's where the popular myth takes its first real hit. If you assume velvet sprang into existence already wrapped in European royal exclusivity, that some Italian or French court simply invented it for themselves, the actual historical and archaeological record tells a much messier, much more geographically distributed story. Pile weave textiles resembling early velvet show up across a range of ancient and early medieval textile traditions well outside Europe, and well before European weavers had any serious command of the technique. The surviving evidence points to sophisticated pile weaving traditions developing across parts of China and across the extensive craft and trade networks of the broader Islamic world, Persia, Egypt, the wider Middle East, where skilled artisans worked within court and merchant patronage systems that looked nothing like the specific European aristocratic exclusivity we associate with velvet today. In other words, velvet's earliest chapters belong to craft guilds, merchant patrons, and religious institutions spread across a genuinely wide swath of the medieval world, not to a single jealous European monarchy that dreamed the fabric up for its own private use. So the actual question isn't, why was velvet always royal? It's, how did a technique with such scattered non-European origins get funneled into becoming one of the most politically weaponized luxury goods in European history? And the answer to that question runs directly through a handful of Italian cities that decided a difficult imported weaving method was worth turning into a state secret. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, several Italian city-states, Genoa, Florence, Venice, and Lucca chief among them, had built serious domestic velvet industries, absorbing techniques through centuries of Mediterranean trade, contact with established Islamic and Byzantine textile centers, then refining that knowledge through generations of guild-controlled craft development. Genoa, in particular, became so closely tied to exceptional velvet that the phrase Genoa velvet functioned across much of Europe the way certain place names still function today as unofficial marks of quality in other goods. What made these cities different wasn't just skill, it was how ruthlessly they protected that skill. The craft guilds running velvet production in these cities were simultaneously trade associations, quality control bodies, and, in blunt practical terms, enforcement mechanisms controlling exactly who was allowed access to the specialized knowledge behind the fabric at all. This secrecy had real teeth. Surviving guild statutes describe severe, specific penalties for weavers caught sharing techniques with outsiders, formal expulsion from the trade, confiscation of equipment and tools, and in some documented cases, genuinely harsh corporal punishment aimed at master weavers who tried to relocate and set up rival operations in competing cities or foreign territories without authorization. This wasn't institutional posturing. Skilled velvet weavers represented something close to strategic economic intelligence, and there are documented historical cases of textile workers being effectively restricted from traveling freely, precisely because their departure risked handing valuable production knowledge to a rival city. Some of the specific penalties on record are genuinely striking. Certain municipal statutes explicitly authorize seizing a departing weaver's property left behind in the city, holding a worker's remaining assets hostage against the possibility of unauthorized emigration. Other surviving records document formal diplomatic correspondence between city-states specifically addressing the recovery or punishment of weavers who'd relocated in violation of guild restrictions, meaning what we'd today file under ordinary labor mobility was, at the time, treated as a matter serious enough for government-to-government negotiation. That level of institutional seriousness makes a lot more sense once you understand that velvet revenue represented a genuinely significant share of some of these city-states' overall economic output. The departure of even a handful of master weavers carrying detailed technical knowledge wasn't a matter of guild pride. It was a measurable threat to a city's prosperity. Which brings us to a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people who assume medieval guild life was purely about craft honor. Economic espionage around velvet was real, documented and ongoing. Rival cities and foreign courts periodically tried to poach skilled velvet weavers through covert recruitment, sometimes offering serious financial incentives or the promise of elevated social status in exchange for weavers willing to risk severe guild retaliation. Some historical accounts describe defecting weavers facing formal denunciation, permanent exile from their home city, or asset seizure targeting family members left behind. The consequences were harsh enough that most weavers who received these offers ultimately declined, which is exactly why the most refined production techniques stayed concentrated inside a genuinely small number of tightly controlled Italian centers for a remarkably long stretch of European history. There's also a quieter, more procedural side to this story that rarely makes it into the popular telling. These guilds didn't just punish leaks after the fact. They built entire systems designed to prevent leaks from ever happening in the first place. Apprenticeships in velvet weaving could stretch across many years, with masters deliberately withholding the most sensitive parts of the technique, precise rod insertion timing, cutting angle, tension calibration, until an apprentice had proven years of loyalty. Workshops were sometimes physically arranged so that no single worker could observe the entire production process start to finish, a kind of compartmentalization that wouldn't look out of place in a modern intelligence agency. It's worth remembering this was happening centuries before anyone had a phrase like trade secret, let alone industrial espionage. These cities were essentially inventing the modern concept of protected proprietary knowledge, one velvet loom at a time. Given how fiercely this knowledge was guarded and how expensive the finished product remained as a direct result, it becomes a lot easier to understand why European authorities eventually decided the fabric needed formal legal boundaries around who could wear it at all. This is where velvet's story intersects directly with political power, and it goes well beyond simple taste or fashion preference. Sumptuary laws restricting velvet appear across numerous European jurisdictions throughout the late medieval and Renaissance periods, and they were often shockingly granular. Some statutes specified not just whether a person of a given rank could wear velvet, but exactly how many inches of velvet trim were legally permitted on a garment, which specific colors were allowed, and even which parts of a garment could legally incorporate the fabric at all, depending on the wearer's precise social standing. These laws frequently drew a hard line between hereditary nobility and the rapidly growing merchant class. Specifically engineered to prevent wealthy merchants from visually presenting themselves as social equals to established noble families, even when those merchants could genuinely afford identical or superior cloth. That courtroom scene we opened with reflects exactly this kind of legal environment. A formal mechanism built to keep an expensive, visible fabric functioning as a marker of inherited status, rather than merely accumulated wealth. Enforcement varied by jurisdiction and period. Monetary fines scaled to a person's presumed wealth, public confiscation of the offending garment, and in some documented cases, forcing the offender to alter or remove the prohibited fabric publicly, in front of witnesses, as a deliberate act of social correction. Historians who study these codes generally note something telling. Enforcement intensity tended to spike during periods of particularly visible merchant prosperity, which suggests these laws weren't a stable, consistently applied legal principle so much as a reactive political tool, deployed with particular urgency whenever the gap between old inherited wealth and new merchant wealth seemed to be closing uncomfortably fast. And here's the genuinely ironic twist buried inside all of this, the detail that really undercuts the popular myth about velvet's origins. The same merchant families these laws were designed to restrict were, in numerous well-documented cases, simultaneously the financial powers actually bankrolling the velvet industries, producing the fabric in the first place. No family illustrates this better than the Medici of Florence. Originally a banking family with no inherited noble title whatsoever, the Medici built extraordinary wealth, partly through banking and partly through deep involvement in Florence's textile economy, including the silk and velvet trades that made the city internationally renowned. They then used that wealth to functionally purchase, marry into, and politically maneuver their way into genuine aristocratic and eventually outright ruling status, both within Florence and later, through strategic marriages, into European royal houses more broadly. Think about what that actually means. The exact fabric legally reserved for hereditary nobility was simultaneously the economic engine funding merchant families actively, successfully working to become nobility, using wealth generated by an industry the law claimed only nobility deserved to visibly wear. This didn't happen overnight. Early Medici wealth built up substantially through banking connected to the wool and silk trade networks running through Florence, with the family gradually expanding influence through strategic loans, careful political alliance building within Florence's existing merchant oligarchy, and consistent, visible patronage of exactly the kind of luxury goods, fine textiles, commissioned art, that signaled taste and sophistication to anyone paying attention. By the 15th century, the family had moved from simply funding Florence's textile economy to directly shaping its political governance, eventually producing multiple Medici popes and connecting the family bloodline directly into French and other European royal houses through carefully arranged marriages. A remarkable trajectory for a family whose foundational wealth traced back to banking and luxury textile commerce, not inherited noble blood. This reveals something the popular myth completely misses. Velvet wasn't a passive symbol that aristocracy already possessed and simply chose to display. It functioned as an active tool of social transformation, a genuinely contested resource that ambitious merchant families used, quite literally, to buy and perform their way into the very social category the fabric was legally supposed to keep them out of. That magistrate, fining an ordinary merchant for wearing the wrong coat, wasn't punishing an isolated rule breaker. He was participating in a much larger ongoing struggle over exactly where the line between old status and new money actual lies at, a line velvet itself was actively helping to blur, even as the law tried desperately to keep it fixed. If velvet's role in secular power struggles was already this politically loaded, Its role inside religious institutions adds another, genuinely significant layer, one that ties the fabric directly to formal ecclesiastical authority across Catholic Europe for centuries. Velvet became deeply embedded in Catholic tradition, appearing prominently in church vestments, altar coverings, and ceremonial furnishings used during the most significant liturgical occasions. Specific colors carried formal symbolic weight within church tradition, including the deep, saturated reds historically associated with cardinals and high church officials. Producing ecclesiastical velvet at the standard expected for major church ceremonies required exactly the same scarce, guarded expertise concentrated in those Italian centers, meaning the Catholic Church became one of the velvet industry's most consistent, high-value patrons throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. A religious institution and a luxury textile trade, bound together by shared dependence on a small pool of specialized craft knowledge, the Church didn't itself control. This overlap wasn't without friction, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than smoothing it over. Some religious commentators and reformers across this period openly criticized the Church's embrace of extraordinarily expensive textiles, including velvet, arguing that this level of material luxury sat uncomfortably next to religious teaching about humility and modest living, a tension that would go on to feed into broader reform movements sweeping Europe in the centuries that followed. The Church's relationship with velvet, in other words, wasn't a simple, uncomplicated embrace of luxury for luxury's sake. It existed inside a genuine internal argument about whether this kind of costly material splendor served the institution's stated spiritual values or quietly undermined them. And now we arrive at the strangest turn in the entire story, the one that connects velvet to a specific European royal court and flips almost every assumption about luxury fashion on its head. During the 16th century, the Spanish Habsburg court under King Philip II became closely associated with an austere, deliberately restrained aesthetic built almost entirely around black clothing, a style contemporaries and later historians frequently framed as reflecting religious seriousness, moral discipline, and a pointed rejection of the colorful, ostentatious fashions common at other European courts. Here's the twist. Producing a genuinely deep, rich, consistent black in fine textiles, including velvet, during this period was extraordinarily difficult and expensive. It required specific dyeing processes, frequently multiple costly dye applications, just to achieve a black dark, and even enough that it wouldn't look faded, brownish, or patchy under candlelight. Which means Spanish court black velvet, for all its outward appearance of restrained modesty, frequently cost more to produce than the bright, colorful velvets and silks it was implicitly positioned against as the supposedly humbler option. Sit with that for a second, because it inverts the entire popular assumption about how luxury signaling is supposed to work. The Spanish court wasn't choosing a cheaper, humbler alternative to colorful aristocratic excess elsewhere in Europe. It was pioneering an entirely new, considerably more expensive form of luxury signaling, built specifically around the appearance of restraint, a fashion strategy that only worked if onlookers already understood exactly how technically difficult and costly genuine deep black textile production actually was, so they could correctly read the supposed humility as the elite status marker it genuinely was. This aesthetic spread significantly across other European courts through the later 16th and into the 17th centuries, influencing formal court fashion well beyond Spain's own borders. An entire movement built around visually performing humility through one of the most technically demanding and expensive dyeing and weaving combinations available anywhere in Renaissance Europe. The chemistry behind this is worth understanding briefly because it explains exactly why black proved so much harder to pull off convincingly than most other colors available to Renaissance dyers. Achieving a genuinely deep, even black on fine fiber typically required either multiple sequential dye baths using different mordant and dye combinations layered carefully on top of one another, or specific dyestuffs that were themselves considerably rarer and more expensive than the materials used for most other colors. And even then, black dye was notoriously prone to fading unevenly or developing an unwanted brownish or greenish undertone over time and repeated wear, meaning maintaining a wardrobe of genuinely deep, consistent black velvet required ongoing investment in re-dyeing and careful upkeep, well beyond the fabric's already substantial initial cost. Spanish court fashion, in other words, required not just the wealth to buy black velvet once, but the sustained wealth to maintain its appearance over time. An entire extra layer of practical exclusivity hiding underneath a look that presented itself, on the surface, as simple and humble. Given everything we've covered, guild secrecy backed by real coercion, economic espionage, sumptuary law, religious controversy, and an entire royal court building a fashion movement around performing restraint, a natural question follows. How did velvet ever escape this intensely controlled, politically weaponized status and become something almost anyone could own? The answer follows a pattern that shows up again and again across textile history. Gradual mechanical innovation, followed eventually by entirely new material inputs that rewrote the fabric's underlying economics. Mechanized power looms, developed and refined throughout the 19th century, gradually automated significant portions of the velvet weaving process, including faster, more consistent rod insertion and cutting mechanisms that dramatically cut the labor hours required per length of finished cloth compared to fully manual traditional production. This didn't happen instantly. Handloom velvet production for the highest-end applications persisted well into the industrial era, and in specialized, much-reduced form, continues even today. But industrial mechanization steadily expanded the volume of velvet available at prices well below the historical hand-woven standard. The truly decisive shift, though, arrived through new fibers rather than new machines. Cotton velveteen, and later fully synthetic pile fabrics using rayon and eventually polyester. Cotton velveteen, the same fundamental pile weave structure, built around cheap cotton fiber instead of silk, became commercially significant, especially through the 19th century, offering something visually and texturally reminiscent of genuine silk velvet at a fraction of the historical cost. Synthetic pile fabrics later pushed the accessible end of the market even further, making a version of velvet's texture available at prices that would have been genuinely unimaginable to the Genoese guildmasters, who once treated their production methods as closely guarded state secrets. There's a quiet irony sitting inside that transition. A fabric whose entire historical prestige rested on scarcity, guarded knowledge, and legally enforced exclusivity became, in a comparatively short historical window against its many preceding centuries of restriction, available to essentially anyone who could afford an ordinary piece of home furnishing or clothing at a completely mainstream price point. The specific plush, directional pile that once required smuggled techniques, guild secrecy enforced through genuine legal and physical coercion, and prices that literally triggered government legislation, is now most commonly encountered as an inexpensive polyester upholstery fabric or a cheap Halloween costume. Modern velvet production reflects this shift clearly. The overwhelming majority of commercially available velvet today is manufactured from synthetic fibers at industrial facilities across multiple global manufacturing regions, while genuine silk velvet production survives only within a comparatively small number of specialized workshops, some directly descended from historical centers, including certain Italian producers who maintain real, traceable connections to techniques passed down from those same guarded medieval and Renaissance traditions. Even the vocabulary shifted to reflect this new reality. The word velveteen itself was coined specifically to mark the cotton version as something distinct from, and understood to be lesser than, genuine silk velvet, a small linguistic fossil of exactly the hierarchy this entire episode has been tracing. You can hear the same instinct today in how fabric houses market a faux velvet versus a genuine velvet pile, still drawing a line between the real thing and its cheap, a cousin. Centuries after the original silk versus cotton distinction first needed a name. Which brings us directly back to where we started. That's the actual reason companies like Holland Sherry, Anstoetz, and Zoffany lean so hard on words like archive, heritage, and atelier when they talk about their velvet ranges today. Once the fabric's basic visual and tactile appeal became available to virtually anyone at virtually any price point, the historical scarcity and craft lineage didn't disappear. It became the product's primary remaining source of value. A Zoffany velvet marketed around its archival ties to 17th and 18th century textile collections isn't selling you pile, weave and dye. It's selling you a fragment of the exact story we just spent the last half hour unpacking. The memory of a fabric so tightly controlled that owning the wrong coat could put you in front of a magistrate. Holland Sherry's decision to build serious mohair velvet ranges, rather than defaulting to the cheapest possible synthetic pile, and Anstoetz's continued investment in dense, technically demanding velvet weaves for high-end upholstery, are both, in their own way, small modern echoes of the same instinct that drove Italian guilds to protect their looms with actual legal force centuries ago. The understanding that difficulty itself has always been part of what made this fabric valuable. So if there's one thread worth pulling from everything this episode has covered, it's this. Velvet's reputation as the fabric of kings was never some natural, inevitable outcome of the material simply being beautiful or pleasant to touch. It was actively constructed, legislated, fought over, and guarded, by guilds protecting trade secrets with genuine coercive force, by governments willing to write criminal penalties around a piece of cloth, by ambitious merchant families who used textile wealth as a literal ladder into aristocracy, and by at least one royal court clever enough to turn the appearance of humiliated tie into its own extraordinarily expensive status symbol. The next time you run your hand across a velvet cushion, or watch a theatre curtain catch the light and shift colour as it sways, you're touching the thoroughly democratized descendant of a fabric that once triggered criminal prosecution, helped fund a merchant family's rise into European royal circles, and gave an entire royal court a new way to redefine what luxury could even mean. If this kind of hidden calculation sitting underneath something as soft and ordinary as a piece of cloth is the sort of thing you find genuinely fascinating, there's more of it waiting. Because it turns out the softest, most seductive materials often carry the hardest, most calculating histories once you actually pull back the pile and look underneath.